The alarm cut through the morning air of Hearth's End before anyone understood what it meant. Hearth's End was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's name. A small farming colony built around a cluster of wheat fields and a single winding river, home to just under 400 families who had chosen to build a quiet life on a world far from the crowded cities of Earth. It was not an important place by any measure the wider galaxy might use. It had no strategic value, no rare resources, nothing that should have ever drawn the attention of anyone beyond its own modest borders. Ivy Bellamy was 8 years old, and she was chasing a small silver drone across the open field behind her house when the sky changed color. One moment the light over the colony was soft and gold, the kind of light that made the wheat fields glow. The next moment, a shadow rolled across the ground, wide and fast, like a curtain being pulled shut. She looked up. A shape was descending from the clouds. It was not one of the supply ships that came twice a month from the orbital station. It was long and dark, with lines of pale blue light running along its sides, and it made almost no sound at all. Ivy stood still, her drone forgotten in the grass, and watched it come lower and lower until the wind from its engines flattened the wheat around her in a perfect circle. Inside her house, her mother, Claire Bellamy, was halfway through pouring a cup of tea when the ground trembled. She set the cup down so fast that it cracked against the counter. Through the window she saw the shape land at the edge of the field, and she saw her daughter standing far too close to it. Claire ran. She did not stop to grab a coat or call for help. She simply ran, barefoot, across the yard and through the gate, shouting Ivy's name with every step. But the field was wide, and the ship was closer to Ivy than the house was. A door opened on the side of the ship, low and smooth, without a sound. 2 tall figures stepped out. They moved with a strange gliding walk, their long limbs folding and unfolding like something built rather than born. Their skin had a faint silver sheen under the morning light, and their eyes were large and dark, without any white showing at all. Ivy had read about other worlds. She had seen pictures in her school lessons of the different peoples who lived among the stars, but she had never seen one standing this close, and she had never imagined one standing this close to her. She took a step back. The taller of the 2 figures raised a hand, not to hurt her, but to calm her, the way someone might approach a frightened animal. It spoke, but the words came out in a language that meant nothing to her, smooth and layered, like several voices speaking at once. Claire was almost there. She was screaming now, a raw and desperate sound that carried across the whole colony, waking neighbors, pulling farmers from their fields, bringing Adam Bellamy running from the workshop where he had been repairing an irrigation pump since dawn. But the second figure moved faster than a human eye could follow. It closed the distance to Ivy in a single fluid motion and lifted her from the ground as easily as lifting a bag of grain. Ivy screamed and kicked, but the arms that held her were unshakable, wrapped in some kind of smooth material that did not yield no matter how hard she struggled. Claire reached the edge of the wheat field just as the ship's door began to close. She threw herself forward, her hands stretching out, brushing against the very edge of the ramp before it sealed shut in front of her. She pounded on the metal with both fists, screaming her daughter's name until her voice broke, but the ship was already rising, lifting off the ground in complete silence, tilting upward, and then vanishing into the clouds, as if it had never been there at all. For a moment, the entire colony stood frozen. Then chaos took over. People ran from every direction, calling for the colony's small defense team, calling for anyone who might know what to do. Adam reached his wife just as her knees gave out beneath her, and he caught her before she collapsed into the flattened wheat. Word reached the colony's communication hub within minutes. The operator on duty that morning, a young man named Owen, patched an emergency signal directly to Earth Defense Command, marked with the highest priority code the outpost had ever used. He did not know exactly what had happened. He only knew that a child was gone, taken by a ship that matched no known registry, and that the ship had come from somewhere far beyond the edge of explored space. It would have ended there, a single tragedy on a distant colony, if not for one small detail that Adam Bellamy had insisted on 2 years earlier, against the advice of colony administrators who considered it unnecessary and old-fashioned. Every child in Hearth's End wore a small locator device, sewn into the lining of their clothing. It was not advanced. It did not use any of the newer tracking systems that other colonies preferred. It was a simple, stubborn piece of technology that Adam had built himself because he did not trust the newer systems to work if the main colony network ever failed. That morning, as the strange ship carried Ivy higher and higher above the clouds, the little device in the seam of her jacket began sending a steady pulse, quiet and constant, up toward the orbital relay station that circled the planet. At Earth Defense Command, more than 100 light-years away, an operator named Grace Whitfield was 3 hours into a quiet overnight shift when a single red light appeared on her console. She almost dismissed it as a system error. Colony locator devices rarely triggered outside of routine check-ins, and this signal was moving in a pattern that made no sense at all. It was rising too fast, too smoothly, and in a direction that no known Earth vessel would travel. Grace pulled up the signal's registration. It was tied to a colony child, a single child, on a remote outpost planet, moving away from that planet at a speed no human aircraft could achieve. Her hands went still over the console. She had spent 6 years in this position, and in that time she had seen false alarms, equipment failures, and the occasional confused wildlife signal from colonies that had not yet mapped their local animal life. But something about this one felt different. The signal was too steady, too deliberate, as if whatever was carrying that tracker wanted to be found, or simply did not know it was there at all. She flagged the signal for immediate review, and sent a direct alert to the overnight commanding officer. Within 10 minutes, 3 more analysts had joined her station, cross-referencing the signal against every known flight path in the region. None of them matched. Within 20 minutes, a senior officer had escalated the alert, all the way to General Nathan Ashford, the officer in charge of Earth's still-developing Deep Space Defense Division. Nathan Ashford was not a man who reacted quickly to unconfirmed reports. He had built his career on caution, on double-checking every piece of information before committing resources. But when he saw the trajectory of the signal, projected out across a hologram display in the command center, his caution gave way to something colder and more urgent. The signal was not just leaving the planet, it was leaving the system entirely, and it was doing so along a path that matched patterns Earth scientists had only recently begun to detect from the far edge of their sensor range. Patterns that belonged to a civilization far older and far larger than anything humanity had yet encountered, a civilization that called itself, in the fragments of communication Earth had managed to intercept over the years, the Galactic Council. Nathan stared at the display for a long moment, watching the small blinking dot move steadily away from a world called Iris 4, carrying with it a single frightened child who did not know that her disappearance was about to change everything. He picked up the comm line to the Defense Council chamber. "Wake everyone," he said. "All of them, now." Within the hour, the full weight of Earth's still young defense network was being pulled into motion. Reports came in from the colony itself, confirming what the tracking signal had already suggested: a ship of unknown origin, 2 occupants of a species not yet catalogued in any human record, a child taken without warning, without explanation, and without any attempt at communication beforehand. Adam and Claire Bellamy sat together in the colony's small medical center, wrapped in blankets despite the warm morning, answering the same questions over and over from officials who had arrived within hours by emergency transport. Claire's hands would not stop shaking. Adam kept his eyes fixed on a small screen that showed nothing but a single moving dot, the last connection he had to his daughter, refusing to look away even for a moment. Far above the planet, the ship carrying Ivy continued its climb toward the edge of the system, passing beyond the reach of any weapon Earth possessed, beyond the reach of any ship fast enough to follow. Inside the ship, Ivy had stopped screaming. She sat curled in a corner of a small chamber, wrapped in something soft that one of the tall figures had given her, watching the strange lights along the walls pulse in slow, steady patterns. She did not understand what was happening to her. She did not understand why she had been taken, or where she was going, or what these strange, silver-skinned beings wanted with an 8-year-old girl from a small farming colony on the edge of known space. But somewhere behind her, back on the world she had left, a signal was still pulsing. A small, stubborn piece of technology that her father had built with his own hands, refusing to stop, refusing to be silent, carrying a single message across the stars, to anyone who was listening. She is here. She is alive. Come find her. And on Earth, In a command center filled with tense, determined faces, that message had already been received. Nathan Ashford stood at the center of the room, watching the last confirmed position of the signal before it passed beyond even the most sensitive equipment Earth possessed. The room was silent except for the low hum of machines and the quiet sound of Grace Whitfield's voice reading out coordinates to a room full of officers who were already beginning to plan. Nobody in that room had ever launched a mission like this before. Nobody had ever faced an enemy from so far beyond their own borders. But as the coordinates were logged and the first orders began to move down the chain of command, one thing was already clear to everyone present. This was no longer just the story of a missing child. This was the beginning of something far larger, something that would test every part of what humanity believed about itself and about its place among the stars. Somewhere out beyond the edge of the solar system, a girl named Ivy Bellamy was being carried further and further from home, and an entire world was about to rise up behind her. The chase had only just begun. Within 2 days, the small farming colony of Hearth's End had become the center of attention for every branch of Earth's defense and diplomatic offices. Ships arrived that the colonists had never seen before, sleek and quiet, carrying officials in uniforms nobody recognized. Adam and Claire Bellamy found themselves moved from their modest home into a secure facility near the colony's landing pad, where analysts studied every scrap of footage from the morning Ivy was taken, searching for anything that might explain who had come for her, and why. At Earth Defense Command, General Nathan Ashford had not slept in over 30 hours. He stood before a wide table covered in projected star charts, watching a team of analysts trace the last known path of the ship that had taken Ivy. The trail led far beyond any territory Earth had ever charted, into a region of space that had only been observed through distant telescopes and fragments of intercepted communication. It was Grace Whitfield who found the first real answer. She had spent years quietly studying signal patterns from deep space, patterns that most of her colleagues dismissed as background noise. Now those patterns made sense. She stood before the command council with a single image displayed behind her, a rough map built from years of overlooked data. "This is not a random encounter," she said. "This is a structured territory, defined borders, repeating signal patterns that suggest organized government communication. We are looking at a civilization, or more likely, a group of civilizations working together. Something old, something large." Beyond the walls of that command room, news of the abduction had already begun spreading through official government channels to select leaders around the world, though the full details remained carefully guarded to prevent panic. Still, rumors traveled fast. Within days, quiet vigils were being held in towns and cities across every continent, ordinary people lighting candles for a girl none of them had ever met, united by nothing more than the simple, aching knowledge that a child was gone, and that their world suddenly felt smaller and more fragile than it had the week before. A murmur passed through the room. One of the council members, a cautious man named Victor Lang, leaned forward. "You are telling us that an organized alien government sent a ship to our colony and took a child, on purpose." "I am telling you," Grace said, "that whoever they are, they knew exactly what they were doing. This was not an accident, and it was not random. Someone chose that colony. Someone chose that child." The room fell into an uneasy silence. It was Nathan who finally spoke. "Then we need to know who chose her, and why. And we need to know before they have any reason to move her again." Over the following days, a picture began to form, pieced together not only from Earth's own limited data, but from an unexpected source. A signal reached Earth's outer relay stations, faint and encrypted, originating from somewhere near the very edge of explored space. It took the science division nearly a full day to decode it, and when they finally did, the message left the entire command staff stunned. The message came from a being who called himself Kale. He identified himself as a member of a species called the Doven, a race that had lived under the rule of the Galactic Council for longer than human history had been recorded. In careful, broken phrases built from fragments of intercepted human transmissions over the years, Kale explained that he had learned of the operation against Earth's colony, and that he did not agree with it. According to Kale, the Council had recently begun negotiations over control of a resource-rich region of space that bordered the edges of Earth's territory. Earth, still new to interstellar contact, had refused to accept the terms offered by the Council, terms that would have handed over control of the region without any real benefit to humanity in return. Rather than continue negotiations, a faction within the council had decided on a different approach. They would remind Earth of its place. The abduction of a human child was never meant to become public knowledge, not even to most of the council itself. It was the work of a smaller enforcement branch, led by a council commander named Vex, who believed that young, undeveloped species needed to be shown the consequences of resistance before they grew too confident. Ivy had been chosen specifically because of her age, because a young hostage created the strongest possible pressure without requiring the council to openly declare conflict. Kale's message ended with a warning. Ivy was being held at a secure council outpost near the border of their territory, a location he was willing to share, but only if Earth was prepared to act quickly. The council's enforcement branch, he warned, was already discussing an official statement, one meant to force Earth into accepting new terms in exchange for the child's safe return. Nathan read the message twice before setting it down. "They want us to believe they hold every advantage," he said, "so we make sure they never get the chance to make that offer." The council chamber was filled with disagreement. Some officers argued for caution, for waiting until Earth's fleet had grown stronger before risking a confrontation with a civilization so far beyond their own experience. Others argued that waiting even a single day risked losing the only chance to recover Ivy safely. It was Grace who finally cut through the argument with a single question. "If it were your child," she said, looking around the room, "would any of you wait?" Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Still, not everyone in the room agreed with the speed of the decision. Victor Lang raised his hand once more, his voice careful but firm. "We are talking about sending our best people, and our only working prototype ship, into territory we do not understand, against an enemy whose full strength we cannot measure. If this fails, we may lose everything we have built, and we still will not have Ivy Bellamy home." "If we do nothing," Nathan said, "we lose her for certain, and we teach whoever is watching that Earth can be threatened without consequence. I would rather fail while trying than succeed at doing nothing." Grace Whitfield stepped forward with a datapad in hand. "There is another consideration." Kale's message included something else, buried near the end. He warned that if Earth did not act within a narrow window of time, the Council would begin using the situation to justify permanent oversight of our system, citing our supposed instability as a threat to regional order. Waiting does not just risk the girl. It risks giving them the excuse they have been looking for. That detail shifted the final holdouts in the room. Within the hour, Earth's defense leadership had approved what would later be remembered as the first true test of humanity's readiness to stand among the stars. It would not be a full military campaign. Earth did not yet have the strength for that. Instead, it would be a focused, carefully planned rescue operation, built around speed, precision, and the element of surprise. Nathan Ashford was given command. He had spent most of his career preparing for exactly this kind of moment, without ever truly believing it would come. He assembled a team not from any single nation's forces, but from every corner of Earth, veteran pilots, engineers, and soldiers who had spent years training under the newly formed Earth Defense Coalition, an organization built specifically to prepare humanity for the possibility of contact beyond their solar system. Among those chosen was a young pilot named Marcus Ellery, known for flying faster and closer to danger than almost anyone else in the coalition. There was also Lily Osei, an engineer whose work on experimental propulsion systems had quietly pushed Earth's ships years ahead of what most officials believed possible. And there was Owen Faraday, a communications specialist who had spent the past year working alongside Grace Whitfield, studying the very signal patterns that had led them here. Together with a dozen more skilled operators, they formed the core of a mission that would carry Earth's first true starship, a vessel named the Steadfast, beyond the edge of known space. Training for the mission moved at a pace nobody had thought possible only weeks earlier. Marcus spent long hours in flight simulators built from data Lily's team had reconstructed from the recovered Council scout ship, learning to anticipate handling patterns unlike anything Earth's own aircraft produced. Grace Tomlin drilled her small ground team through mock rescue scenarios built inside a hollowed-out cargo hangar, practicing movements through corridors sized and shaped to match what little was known about Council architecture. Owen worked almost without sleep, building translation software from the fragments of language Kale had shared, determined that no member of the team would be left unable to understand a warning or a command in the moment it mattered most. Kale, for his part, spent much of that time answering question after question from Earth's officers, patiently walking them through everything he remembered about Council patrol schedules, security protocols, and the layout of outposts similar to the one where Ivy was believed to be held. It was during one of these long sessions that Nathan finally asked him the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since his first transmission reached Earth. Why risk everything for a species you only just learned exists? Kale was quiet for a moment before answering. My own child was taken from our homeworld many years ago, conscripted into Council service before she was old enough to understand what that meant. I never saw her again. I could not save her. When I learned what had happened to your colony, I told myself I would not watch it happen to another family while I still had the ability to do something. He paused. Perhaps that will not undo what happened to my own daughter, but it is not nothing. Nathan said nothing for a long moment, simply placing a hand briefly on the alien's shoulder before returning to the preparations. It was not translation software or shared strategy that had truly bound the mission together in that instant. It was a simple, painful understanding, shared between someone who still had the chance to bring a stolen child home, and someone who had lost that same chance long ago. Every member of the chosen team understood the weight of what they were about to attempt. None of them had trained for a mission quite like this, because until a few days earlier, nobody on Earth had believed such a mission would ever be necessary. Still, each of them arrived at the final briefing with the same quiet determination, the understanding that whatever fear they carried mattered less than the small girl waiting somewhere among the stars for someone to come find her. The Steadfast had been built in secret over the past 3 years, a joint project between Earth's leading scientists and engineers, designed specifically for the possibility of a mission like this one. It was faster than anything the Council had likely encountered from a species as young as Earth, built using principles that Lily Osei and her team had developed from careful, patient study of intercepted alien technology fragments recovered from a failed Council scouting mission years earlier. Kale offered to guide them personally, risking his own safety by openly defying the Council he had served his entire life. When Nathan asked him why he was willing to take such a risk, Kale's answer was simple. I have watched my people follow every order given to us for longer than your history has existed, he said. I have never seen a species refuse to comply, not even once. I want to see what happens when one finally does. As the Steadfast prepared for departure, Adam and Claire Bellamy were brought to the launch facility to see the ship before it left. Claire held Nathan's hand for a long moment before he boarded, her eyes red from days of exhaustion and fear. Bring her home, she said. It was not a request. It was something closer to a command, spoken with the full weight of a mother's desperation. I intend to, Nathan answered. The Steadfast launched at dawn, carrying with it the hopes of an entire colony, and soon, the attention of an entire planet. News of the mission had begun to spread despite efforts to keep it contained, and by the time the ship crossed beyond Earth's outer defense perimeter, millions of people across the world were watching, waiting, praying for news of a little girl most of them had never met, but who had somehow become the symbol of everything humanity was willing to fight for. Inside the ship, Nathan stood at the command console, watching the stars stretch and blur as the Steadfast entered its first experimental jump, a technology tested only a handful of times before this moment. Kale stood beside him, his large dark eyes fixed on the same view, though what he saw in it was something entirely different from what Nathan saw. For Nathan, this was hope, wrapped in fear, wrapped in the fierce determination to bring a child home. For Kale, it was something he had never expected to witness in his long life of service to the Council. It was the very first spark of rebellion, carried not by his own people, who had long ago lost the will to resist, but by a species barely old enough to understand the size of the universe they had just stepped into. Neither of them spoke as the stars blurred into streaks of light around them, carrying the Steadfast further from home than any human vessel had ever traveled, toward a Council outpost where a frightened 8-year-old girl waited, not knowing that an entire world was already coming for her. Behind them, Earth held its breath. Ahead of them, a war neither side had chosen was about to begin. The Council outpost sat at the edge of a dim orange star, a massive structure built into the side of a hollowed-out asteroid, its surface lined with landing platforms and defense towers that glowed faintly blue against the darkness of space. Kale had described it during the journey as a minor administrative post, small compared to the true centers of council power, but heavily guarded all the same, since it served as a staging ground for operations along the border regions. Nathan studied the outpost through the Steadfast's long-range scanners as the ship slowed its approach, staying carefully outside the range of the outpost's detection field. Lily Osei worked quickly at her console, adjusting the ship's systems to reduce its signature, using techniques she had spent months developing but never fully tested outside of simulations. "If this works," she said quietly, "they won't see us until we want them to." "And if it doesn't?" Marcus asked from the pilot's seat. "Then we find out very quickly how strong their defense towers really are." Kale guided them toward a narrow approach corridor along the far side of the asteroid, an old maintenance route rarely used since the outpost's expansion years earlier. According to him, it was the only path that offered any real chance of slipping past the outer defense grid unnoticed. It was narrow, difficult to navigate, and would require precise flying through jagged rock formations at high speed. Marcus did not hesitate. He guided the Steadfast into the corridor with a steady hand, weaving through narrow gaps in the rock with only meters to spare on either side. Nathan stood behind him, watching the scanners for any sign that they had been detected, his jaw tight with tension as the ship slipped closer and closer to the heart of the outpost. They reached a hidden docking point Kale had used before in his years of service, a small maintenance bay tucked into the shadow of a larger structure, far from the main entrances where security was heaviest. The Steadfast settled into the bay with barely a sound, and for a long moment, nobody breathed. No alarms sounded. No lights flashed red across the console. They had made it inside undetected. Nathan assembled his team quickly. Along with Marcus and Owen Faraday, he chose 2 more members of the coalition team, a quiet, capable soldier named Grace Tomlin, and a young technician named Noah Whitby, whose skill with unfamiliar systems had proven invaluable during the mission's preparation. Lily remained behind to keep the ship ready for a fast departure, while Kale led the ground team through the outpost's inner corridors, drawing on years of memory from his time serving within similar council facilities. The interior of the outpost was unlike anything the team had trained for. The corridors were tall and narrow, built for beings taller than the average human, lit by the same pale blue light that had marked the ship at Hearth's End. Kale moved through the space with practiced ease, guiding them past patrol routes he remembered from his years of service, though he warned them that any information he had was already years out of date. "They will have changed some patrols since I left," he said quietly. "Stay close, stay quiet." They moved through the outpost in careful, measured steps, avoiding 2 separate patrols of council guards, through narrow side passages Kale remembered from his time there. Owen worked quickly at each security checkpoint they encountered, using a small device built specifically for this mission to override the outpost's simpler control systems, a task made possible only because of data Kale had shared during their journey. Halfway through the winding corridors, the team encountered an obstacle Kale had not anticipated. A maintenance crew, 3 council workers repairing a damaged support strut, blocked the only route forward, their equipment scattered across the width of the passage. There was no side corridor to slip around them, and no time to wait for them to finish. Noah Whitby stepped forward before anyone could stop him, adjusting the collar of his jacket to hide the unfamiliar cut of his uniform in the dim light. He approached the workers with slow, deliberate steps, speaking a handful of simple phrases Owen had taught him during the journey, phrases meant to sound like a routine request to clear the corridor for an unrelated inspection. His accent was rough, his grammar almost certainly wrong, but the workers, tired and eager to avoid extra scrutiny from what they assumed was a passing supervisor, gathered their tools and moved aside without argument. Nathan let out a slow breath as the team slipped past. "Where did you learn to do that?" "I didn't," Noah admitted quietly. "I was hoping it would work." It was Grace Tomlin who first noticed the shift in the air, a change in the ambient hum of the outpost systems that suggested they were nearing a more secure section of the facility. Kale confirmed her instincts a moment later, pointing toward a heavily reinforced door at the end of the corridor ahead. "That leads to the holding section," he said. "If she is here, that is where they will be keeping her." The door was guarded by 2 council enforcers, tall and broad-shouldered, standing at either side with weapons held ready. Nathan studied them for a long moment, weighing their options. A direct confrontation risked alerting the rest of the outpost before they could reach Ivy, but there was no other way through. It was Noah who offered a solution, pointing to a ventilation shaft running along the ceiling above the corridor, wide enough for a person to crawl through if they moved carefully. It was a risk, but a smaller one than a direct fight. For a moment, nobody moved, each of them weighing the risk of what came next. Kale crouched low beside the group, keeping his voice to the barest whisper. Once we open that door, there is no quiet way back out. Whatever happens after this, it happens fast. Nathan looked at each member of his team in turn, and saw the same steady resolve reflected back at him from every face. There would be no hesitation, no second guessing. They had come too far to turn back now. Grace Tomlin volunteered without hesitation. She moved silently along the shaft, working her way above the guarded door until she reached a maintenance grate positioned directly above the 2 enforcers. With careful timing, she used a small device Lily had built specifically for this mission, releasing a brief pulse that overloaded the enforcer's communication equipment just long enough to create a moment of confusion. In that single moment of confusion, Nathan and Marcus moved. It was over quickly and carefully, the team subduing both guards without causing serious harm, restraining them before they could raise any alarm. Owen worked fast to override the door's security controls, and after a tense few seconds, the heavy door slid open. Inside, the holding section was smaller than expected, a narrow hallway lined with a handful of secure rooms. Kale led them straight to the far end, where a single door stood separate from the others, marked with a symbol he explained was used to designate a priority detainee. Nathan opened the door himself. Ivy sat curled in the corner of a small, dimly lit room, wrapped in the same soft material she had been given days earlier, her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked up sharply at the sound of the door opening, her eyes wide with fear, expecting another stranger, another moment of confusion in a place she did not understand. In the days before the rescue team arrived, Ivy had learned to survive her fear in small, quiet ways. She had counted the lines along the ceiling of her room until she knew the exact number by heart. She had refused, again and again, to answer the questions asked of her by a rotating series of council officials, not out of bravery she recognized in herself, but simply because she missed her mother's voice too much to want to use her own for anyone else. One of her captors, a quieter member of the outpost staff who brought her meals twice a day, had once left a small carved token beside her food, a simple, smooth stone shaped like a bird, offered without explanation. She had kept it clutched in her hand ever since, refusing to let it go even in sleep. It was still there, pressed tightly into her small fist, when the door finally opened. Instead of another stranger, she saw a group of people who looked like her. Nathan crouched down slowly, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Ivy, my name is Nathan. Your parents sent us. We are here to bring you home." For a long moment, Ivy simply stared at him, as if she could not quite believe the words were real. Then, all at once, the fear broke, and she scrambled forward into his arms, holding on to him with a grip far stronger than her small frame suggested. "I want to go home," she whispered. "I know," Nathan said. "We're going to take you there right now." Ivy clung to Nathan's shoulder as he carried her, her small hand still wrapped tightly around the smooth carved stone she had kept since her first days in captivity. She did not cry out or struggle. She simply held on, watching the unfamiliar corridors blur past, trusting, for the first time since she had been taken, that the people around her intended to keep their word. They moved quickly back through the corridors, retracing their path with Ivy carried carefully between them. But as they approached the maintenance bay where the Steadfast waited, an alarm finally sounded, sharp and loud, echoing through the entire outpost. Somewhere behind them, the 2 restrained guards had been discovered. "Move," Nathan said, and the team broke into a run. They reached the Steadfast just as the first council enforcers rounded the corridor behind them, weapons raised, shouting orders in a language none of them understood, but all of them recognized the meaning of. Lily had the ship ready, engines already warming, the boarding ramp lowering the moment she saw them approaching. The team scrambled aboard, Nathan carrying Ivy directly to a secure seat near the back of the ship, while Marcus sprinted for the pilot's chair. The ramp sealed shut behind them, just as the first pulse of energy from an enforcer's weapon struck the outer hull, rattling the entire ship, but causing no serious damage. "We're leaving!" Marcus called, already pulling the Steadfast into motion. The ship shot out of the maintenance bay and back into open space, and the true danger of the mission began. Alarms blared across the outpost's defense network, and within moments, 3 Council patrol ships launched from the outpost's main platforms, moving to intercept the fleeing vessel. Nathan moved to the command console, watching the pursuit ships close in on the display. "Lily, how fast can we jump?" "Not fast enough," she called back. "We need at least 2 minutes to charge the jump drive. If they catch us before then, we're in trouble." "Then we buy 2 minutes," Nathan said. Marcus guided the Steadfast into a sharp turn, weaving between debris fields scattered around the outpost, using every bit of skill he had to keep the pursuing ships from gaining a clear line. The Council pilots, confident in their superior numbers, closed the distance quickly, firing warning shots meant to force the Steadfast to slow. Marcus refused to slow. He pushed the ship harder, diving through a narrow gap between 2 large chunks of rock, a maneuver that would have destroyed a less capable pilot's ship instantly. One of the pursuing vessels, attempting to follow too closely, clipped its wing against the rock formation and spun away, out of the chase entirely. 2 ships remained, closing in fast. Owen worked desperately at his console, using the data Kale had provided about Council ship systems to identify a weakness in their pursuit formation. "Their shields are weaker on a direct rear approach," he called out. "If we can get one of them to overextend, we might be able to slip past their formation." Kale, watching the display with a mixture of fear and something that looked almost like wonder, spoke up. "Let me try something." He moved to a secondary console, one that controlled the Steadfast's communication systems, and began transmitting a rapid series of coded signals, the same emergency recall codes he remembered from his years serving within the Council's enforcement branch. It was a desperate gambit, but it worked. One of the pursuing ships suddenly broke formation, pulling back sharply as its pilot, confused by the unexpected recall signal, hesitated just long enough for the Steadfast to widen the gap. The pilot of the final ship was younger than the others, his flying sharp and impatient, the kind of aggressive pursuit that came from a desire to prove himself rather than years of disciplined training. He closed the gap faster than caution should have allowed, pushing his own vessel dangerously close to the debris field in his determination not to let the Steadfast escape. "He's not going to back off," Marcus said, watching the display. "He's too close to his own wreckage risk. One more hard turn and he might do our job for us." The pilot of the final ship pressed forward alone, faster and more aggressive than the others, closing the distance with reckless speed. 30 seconds until jump," Lily called out. The pursuing ship fired again, a direct hit this time, striking the Steadfast's rear shields and sending a violent shudder through the entire vessel. Sparks flew from a damaged console near the back of the bridge, and for a terrifying moment, the ship's power flickered. "Shields at 40%, Owen reported, his voice tight with tension. 15 seconds, Lily called. Marcus banked the ship hard, forcing the pursuing vessel to overcorrect in an attempt to keep its aim locked, buying just enough distance for the Steadfast systems to stabilize. 5 seconds. Ivy, still held securely in her seat near the back of the ship, closed her eyes tightly, gripping the straps of her harness with both hands. "Jump!" Lily shouted. The stars outside the ship stretched into long streaks of light, and the entire vessel lurched forward with a force that pressed everyone back into their seats. For a single, breathless moment, the world outside the ship dissolved into pure light and motion. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The Steadfast emerged into open, empty space, far beyond the reach of the Council outpost, the pursuing ship left behind entirely. Silence settled over the bridge, broken only by the sound of the ship's systems slowly stabilizing. Nathan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and looked back toward Ivy, who was staring at him with wide, exhausted eyes. "We made it," he said softly. "You're safe now." But even as relief spread through the ship, Kale's expression remained tense, his dark eyes fixed on the display showing their position relative to Council territory. "This will not be forgotten," he said quietly. "What happened here today? The humiliation of losing a hostage, the defiance shown against Council forces, it will not stay quiet. The Council does not simply accept this kind of loss without response." Nathan looked at him, understanding beginning to settle in alongside the relief of the moment. "Then we had better be ready for what comes next," he said. Behind them, in the depths of Council territory, word of the failed operation was already spreading through the highest levels of Council leadership, and a new, far more dangerous chapter was about to begin. News of the rescue reached Earth before the Steadfast itself returned home. Grace Whitfield was the first to receive the encoded transmission from Owen Faraday, a short burst of data confirming what an entire planet had been waiting to hear. Ivy Bellamy was safe. The mission had succeeded. The message spread within minutes, first through official channels, then across every form of communication humanity had. In cities and towns across the world, people who had never met Ivy Bellamy or her parents found themselves celebrating as though she were their own family. For the first time in human history, the entire planet had watched a single, unified effort succeed against a threat from beyond their own solar system, and the joy of that victory was impossible to contain. At the colony of Hearth's End, Adam and Claire Bellamy stood at the landing platform when the Steadfast finally returned, watching the ship descend through the same sky their daughter had been taken from only days earlier. When the ramp lowered and Ivy ran down it into her mother's arms, the sound of Claire's relief echoed across the entire colony, a sound that seemed to carry every ounce of fear and hope she had held onto since the morning her daughter disappeared. But in the quiet aftermath of celebration, a smaller, more serious meeting was already taking place within Earth Defense Command. Nathan Ashford stood before the full Defense Council, along with Kale, whose presence in the room marked the first time a member of another species had ever addressed Earth's leadership directly. "You should understand what this means," Kale said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to explain. "The operation against your colony was carried out by a faction within the Council, led by Commander Vex, without full approval from the highest levels of Council leadership. Its failure, and the embarrassment it caused, will not be allowed to stand unanswered." "What are you saying?" Victor Lang asked. "I am saying that the Council does not simply accept defeat quietly," Kale answered. "They will need to demonstrate strength, both to other species under their control, and to any who might see your success as an example worth following. I believe they will respond with force, and soon." The room fell into tense silence. Nathan stepped forward. "Then we prepare," he said. "We already know this is coming. That gives us an advantage we didn't have before." Over the following weeks, Earth's defense network shifted into a state of readiness, unlike anything the planet had experienced before. Every available resource was directed towards strengthening the young Earth Defense Coalition, expanding the fleet, training new pilots, and refining the technology that had made the Steadfast's mission possible. Lily Osei led a growing team of engineers working around the clock to prepare additional ships based on the lessons learned from their first encounter with Council technology. Kale remained on Earth, working closely with Grace Whitfield and her analysts to help interpret the fragments of Council communication they continued to intercept. Through his help, Earth's leadership began to understand the true scale of what they were facing. The Galactic Council was not a single unified force, but a vast alliance of many different species, some willing participants, many others held under Council rule through generations of quiet control, rather than open conflict. It was this detail that gave Nathan an idea. "If the Council rules through control rather than loyalty," he said during one strategy meeting, "then perhaps we are not facing a single enemy. Perhaps we are facing many peoples who have simply never had a reason to believe resistance was possible." Kale considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "There are species within Council space who have quietly resented their position for generations. Word of what happened at the outpost has already begun to spread beyond official channels. Some may see your success as something worth paying attention to." It was a fragile hope, but Earth's leadership chose to pursue it. Small, careful diplomatic missions were sent out along the edges of Council territory, guided by Kale's knowledge of which regions might be receptive to contact. Progress was slow and dangerous, but within a few months, Earth had established quiet contact with two smaller species living under Council rule. a technologically skilled people called the Auronite, and a resilient, independent people known as the Corvel, both of whom had long resented the terms of their submission to council authority. The first meeting with the Auronite nearly ended before it began. Owen Faraday led the small diplomatic team, accompanied by Kale, to a quiet trading station along the border, where a handful of Auronite engineers had agreed to a cautious, unofficial conversation. The engineers arrived guarded and suspicious, certain that the meeting was some kind of council trap meant to identify dissenters within their ranks. It was only when Kale spoke openly about his own daughter and about what he had witnessed at the outpost that the youngest of the Auronite delegates, a sharp-eyed engineer named Vel, finally lowered her guard. "We have wanted to believe change was possible for a long time," Vel said quietly. "We simply never had proof that it could survive contact with the Council's response. You may be that proof, or you may be another reason for them to tighten their control over everyone who ever hoped otherwise." The Corvel proved a different kind of challenge entirely. Rather than caution, their delegation met Earth's outreach with blunt, immediate questions about strength, about whether Earth's forces could truly stand against a Council fleet, or whether they were being asked to gamble their people's safety on a species too young to understand the cost of that kind of defiance. It was Grace Tomlin, meeting with a senior Corvel officer over the course of several tense days, who finally earned their trust, not through promises, but by openly admitting how much Earth still did not know, and by asking for their guidance rather than their obedience. "You do not pretend to already have the answers," the Corvel officer told her at the end of their final meeting. "That, more than any weapon, is why we will stand with you." Both alliances remained fragile, built on cautious trust rather than certainty, but they gave Earth something it had never had before: allies who understood the Council not through distant reports, but through generations of lived experience. Meanwhile, the Council's response finally arrived, and it was every bit as severe as Kale had warned. A massive fleet, larger than anything Earth's sensors had ever detected, began moving toward the outer edge of human territory. Commander Vex, seeking to reclaim his reputation after the failure at the outpost, had convinced Council leadership to authorize a full military response, framed publicly not as retaliation for a failed abduction, but as a necessary response to what the Council described as an act of unprovoked aggression against a peacekeeping mission. Nathan Ashford stood before Earth's Defense Council once again, watching the projected image of the approaching fleet with a grim expression. "They are not simply coming to negotiate," Grace Whitfield said quietly. "This is meant to be an example. If they succeed here, no other species under their control will ever consider resistance again." "Then we cannot allow them to succeed," Nathan said. Earth's fleet, still small compared to the approaching Council force, prepared for what many feared would be an impossible battle. But Nathan had learned an important lesson from the mission that saved Ivy Bellamy. Earth's greatest strength was not its size, or even its technology, but its adaptability, and its refusal to accept defeat as inevitable. Working alongside Lily's engineering team and the newly formed alliance with the Auronite and Corvel peoples, Earth developed a defense strategy built not around meeting the Council fleet head-on, but around disrupting its ability to fight as a unified force. Auronite engineers, whose skill with energy systems far exceeded even Earth's most advanced research, helped design a series of disruption devices capable of interfering with Council communication and shield systems. Corvel scouts, familiar with the tactics used by Council enforcement fleets, provided crucial intelligence on how the coming battle was likely to unfold. When the Council fleet finally reached the edge of Earth's territory, they found not the disorganized, easily overwhelmed defense they expected, but a coordinated resistance unlike anything they had encountered from a species so recently introduced to interstellar conflict. The battle that followed stretched across days rather than hours, fought not in a single decisive clash, but across a series of smaller engagements along the border of human territory. Marcus Ellery, now leading a full squadron of Earth's fastest ships, used the same aggressive, unpredictable flying that had saved the Steadfast during its escape from the outpost to disrupt the Council fleet's rigid formations again and again. Grace Tomlin led ground teams in a series of careful sabotage missions against smaller Council outposts along the border, weakening their ability to resupply and reinforce the main fleet. One of the most decisive moments of those early days came at a scattering of mining platforms known as the Corin Belt. a resource outpost the Council fleet had intended to use as a forward supply base. Marcus led a small strike team in a night engagement, exploiting the platform's narrow docking corridors to trap and disable 3 Council resupply vessels before their escorts could respond. The loss cost Vex's fleet critical fuel reserves and forced his ships to operate at reduced range for the remainder of the campaign, a single tactical setback that would echo through every engagement that followed. Slowly, painfully, the tide of the conflict began to shift. The Council fleet, built around generations of unquestioned dominance, struggled to adapt to an enemy that refused to fight the way their strategies expected. Every time they adjusted to one tactic, Earth's forces, guided by Nathan's growing understanding of unconventional warfare, shifted to another. Each passing day of the campaign brought new lessons. Oronite pilots learned to trust the unpredictable, instinctive style of Earth's flyers, even when it defied every principle of formation flying they had been taught. Corvo ground teams grew skilled at working alongside Grace Tomlin's squads, blending their own patient, methodical approach with the faster, more improvisational tactics Earth had developed out of necessity, rather than tradition. What began as a fragile, uncertain alliance was slowly becoming something sturdier, forged in the shared experience of standing together against a force that had once seemed impossible to resist. Word of the resistance spread quickly beyond the battle itself. Other species living under Council rule, many of whom had quietly followed the story since the failed abduction at Hearth's End, began to take notice. Small acts of resistance started appearing across Council territory: delayed shipments, quiet refusals to follow orders, minor acts of sabotage carried out by people who had never before believed change was possible. Vex had built his entire career on the belief that strength alone determined order in the galaxy, a belief shaped by decades of watching smaller species submit to Council authority without ever seriously testing it. The failure at the outpost had cost him standing among his peers, and the growing resistance spreading across the border worlds threatened to end his career entirely if it was not crushed quickly. For Vex, this campaign had stopped being about Earth's resources or the original treaty dispute. It had become a matter of proving, to himself as much as to anyone else, that the old order still held. That need for personal vindication made him reckless in ways his more cautious superiors had not anticipated. Brander Vex, watching his carefully planned campaign unravel, grew increasingly desperate. He pushed his remaining forces harder, ordering increasingly aggressive tactics in an attempt to force a quick, decisive victory before the growing unrest across Council territory could spread any further. It was during one of these desperate pushes that Kale, working alongside Owen Faraday and Grace Whitfield, intercepted a critical piece of information. Vex intended to bypass the border conflict entirely and launch a direct strike against Earth itself, hoping that a decisive blow against the planet's home defenses would end the resistance before it could grow any stronger. Nathan received the news with grim determination. "If he reaches Earth," Grace Whitfield said, "everything we've built could be lost in a single strike." "Then we make sure he never reaches Earth," Nathan answered. Gathering every available ship from Earth's fleet, along with newly arrived reinforcements from their Oronite and Corvel allies, Nathan prepared to make his stand at the very edge of the solar system, determined to protect not just Earth itself, but everything that had been built in the months since a single child had been taken from a quiet farming colony. As the combined fleet moved into position, word continued to spread across the stars, carried not through official channels, but through the growing whispers of species who had spent generations believing resistance against the Council was impossible. A young, undeveloped species had refused to submit. And for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, an empire built on unquestioned control was beginning to feel the weight of its own fear. The edge of the solar system had never seen anything like the gathering that assembled there in the final days before Commander Vex's fleet arrived. Earth's ships, now numbering in the hundreds thanks to months of tireless work by Lily Osei and her engineering teams, formed a wide defensive line stretching across the outer approach to the sun. Alongside them floated the sleek, angular vessels of the Oronite, their hulls humming with the same advanced energy systems that had given Earth's forces such an unexpected edge in the earlier border conflicts. Further along the line, the sturdy, heavily armored ships of the Corvel held their position, crewed by pilots who had spent generations learning to survive under Council rule, and who now, for the first time, had the chance to fight back. Nathan Ashford stood on the bridge of the Steadfast, watching the long-range scanners as Vex's fleet approached, larger and more heavily armed than anything they had faced before. Kale stood beside him, his expression unreadable, though the tension in his posture betrayed the weight of what was about to happen. "He will not hold back this time," Kale said quietly. "Vex has staked everything on this attack. If he fails here, he loses everything he has built his reputation on." "Then he has a lot in common with us," Nathan said. "We're not holding back either." Across the fleet, final preparations were underway. Grace Tomlin coordinated with ground defense teams stationed on Earth's orbital platforms, ensuring that if any part of Vex's fleet slipped past the main defensive line, a second layer of resistance would be waiting. Owen Faraday worked alongside Oronite communication specialists, preparing to deploy the disruption technology that had proven so effective during earlier engagements, technology now refined and strengthened through months of careful testing. Marcus Ellery led his squadron into position at the farthest edge of the defensive line, ready to strike the first blow the moment Vex's fleet came within range. Beside him flew a growing number of pilots who had trained under his guidance over the past months, humans who, only a year earlier, had never imagined they would one day fly into battle against an enemy from beyond their own galaxy. When Vex's fleet finally emerged at the edge of sensor range, the sheer size of it was enough to silence even the most confident voices across the defensive line. Ship after ship appeared, stretching in a formation that seemed to swallow the darkness of space itself, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of a force that had never once doubted its own superiority. Nathan opened a channel to the entire combined fleet, his voice steady, despite the weight of the moment. "Everyone knows their role," he said. "We do not meet them head-on. We do not give them the fight they expect. We fight the way we always have, together, unpredictable and unwilling to give up. Hold the line." The battle began not with a single dramatic clash, but with a careful, coordinated disruption. As Vex's fleet advanced, Owen and the Oronite communication team activated the disruption devices, sending a wave of interference through the Council fleet's command network. For a critical few moments, coordination between Vex's ships faltered, formations breaking apart as individual pilots struggled to receive updated orders. It was in that window of confusion that Marcus led the first strike, guiding his squadron through the disrupted Council formation with the same aggressive, unpredictable flying that had defined every battle since the mission that saved Ivy Bellamy. Ship after ship on both sides exchanged fire, the darkness of space lit by flashes of energy, as the two fleets collided along the edge of the solar system. The Corvell ships, built for endurance rather than speed, held the center of the defensive line, absorbing the heaviest of the Council's advancing force, while Oronite vessels used their superior energy systems to target and disable key Council command ships before they could regroup. Midway through the engagement, Marcus found himself cut off from the rest of his squadron, surrounded by 3 Council fighters who had recognized his ship from earlier skirmishes along the border and seemed determined to end the threat he posed once and for all. His shields dropped rapidly under the combined fire, and for a long, breathless moment, it seemed certain his ship would be lost. It was Vel, the young Oronite engineer who had once questioned whether Earth's proof could survive contact with the Council, who broke formation to come to his aid, her ship's unfamiliar weapons technology catching the attacking fighters completely off guard. Together, the two pilots, from worlds that had not known of each other's existence a year earlier, fought their way clear, and in that single desperate exchange, the fragile alliance between their peoples became something neither of them would ever forget. "I owe you one," Marcus said over the comm, his voice unsteady with adrenaline. "You owe my people nothing," Vel answered. "Today, we are simply on the same side." On the ground defense platforms circling Earth, Grace Tomlin's teams watched the distant battle unfold across their monitors, ready to act the moment any part of the fight reached close enough to threaten the planet directly. Families across the world gathered around whatever screens they could find, watching fragments of footage relayed from the edge of the system, holding on to each small piece of news the way Claire and Adam Bellamy had once held on to a single blinking signal months earlier. Nathan guided the Steadfast through the heart of the battle, coordinating the shifting defense as reports came in from every corner of the fleet. Despite the disruption and Earth's coordinated tactics, Vex's forces remained a serious threat, their sheer numbers allowing them to press forward even as individual ships fell. Then, just as the battle reached its most desperate point, a new set of signals appeared on the long-range scanners, approaching from beyond the edge of Council territory. Grace Whitfield's voice came through the comm system, sharp with disbelief. "Nathan, you need to see this." A new fleet had arrived, smaller than either the Council's forces or Earth's combined defense, but unmistakable in its origin. Ships bearing the markings of at least 4 additional species, none of whom Earth had ever made direct contact with, moved into position alongside the defensive line, adding their strength to the growing resistance. Cale stared at the display, something close to disbelief in his expression. "Word has spread further than I ever imagined possible," he said quietly. "These are species who have lived under Council rule, far longer than the Oronite or Corvel. If they are here, it means the unrest we hoped for has grown into something far larger than a scattered rebellion." The arrival of the additional fleet turned the tide of the battle decisively. Faced with a coalition far larger and more determined than anything his intelligence had predicted, Vex's forces began to falter, formations breaking apart as more and more ships either retreated or, in a growing number of cases, turned to join the resistance entirely, their crews finally seeing an opportunity they had never believed possible. Vex himself refused to retreat, pushing his flagship directly toward the heart of the defensive line in a desperate attempt to reach Earth itself before his forces collapsed entirely. Nathan, recognizing the threat, guided the Steadfast directly into Vex's path, along with a small group of Earth's most capable ships. The confrontation between the two flagships was brief but intense, each side trading everything they had in a desperate final exchange. It was Lily Osei's careful engineering, built into every system of the Steadfast, that ultimately gave Earth's ship the edge it needed. A precisely targeted strike disabled Vex's primary shield generator, leaving his flagship vulnerable at the critical moment. Facing certain defeat, and with his own forces collapsing around him, Vex was left with no choice but to withdraw, his flagship retreating from the battlefield, along with the remaining ships still loyal to his command. The Council's grand demonstration of strength had ended not in triumph, but in humiliation, witnessed not only by Earth's forces, but by representatives of nearly a dozen species who had, until that day, believed resistance against Council rule was nothing more than a distant, impossible dream. The battle's end did not bring an immediate peace, but it brought something far more powerful: proof. In the weeks that followed, word of the Council's defeat spread across every corner of their territory, carried not through official channels, but through the same quiet, determined whispers that had brought reinforcements to Earth's defense in its most desperate hour. Species who had lived under Council rule for generations began to openly question the authority they had always believed absolute. Small acts of resistance grew into larger, more organized movements, as more and more of the Council's subject species realized that the empire they had feared for so long was not as unshakable as it had always seemed. Cale, now openly acting as a representative for a growing coalition of species seeking independence from Council rule, worked closely with Earth's leadership to organize what would eventually become one of the most significant shifts in the balance of power the region of space had ever seen. Rather than seeking to conquer or destroy the Council entirely, Earth and its allies focused on something more lasting, exposing the truth of generations of unfair treatment, forcing the Council's leadership to finally answer for the choices they had made. A final confrontation took place not on a battlefield, but within the very heart of Council territory, at the Grand Central Chamber where Council leadership had governed for longer than any single species could remember. Nathan Ashford stood before that chamber, alongside representatives from Earth, the Oronite, the Corvel, and a growing number of species who had once believed themselves powerless against Council authority. Chancellor Threll, the highest-ranking member of Council leadership, faced the gathered representatives with an expression caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. "You believe a handful of scattered rebellions changes anything," Threll said. "The Council has stood for longer than your species has existed." "The Council stood," Nathan answered, "because no one ever believed it could be questioned. That belief is gone now. Whatever comes next, it will not be built on quiet fear anymore." Threll's gaze moved slowly across the gathered representatives, lingering for a long moment on Cale, whose presence among them seemed to unsettle the Chancellor more than any human officer could. "You served this council faithfully for longer than most of your kind live," Threll said. "And this is how you repay that service." "I served out of fear," Kale answered quietly. "Not loyalty. There is a difference, though it took me a very long time, and the loss of everything I loved, to understand it. I am not here for revenge, Chancellor. I am here so that no one else has to learn that difference the way I did." The chamber fell silent. For the first time in longer than any record could confirm, the Council's highest authority had no answer ready. The negotiations that followed stretched across many long weeks, and were rarely simple. Some members of the Council leadership resisted every proposed change, clinging to the old order out of genuine belief that it had kept peace across their territory for longer than any alternative could promise. Others resisted out of fear of losing power they had held for generations, unwilling to imagine a version of their civilization where smaller species held any real voice at all. Vel and the Corvell officer who had come to trust Grace Tomlin both sat at the negotiating table in those weeks, insisting, session after session, that whatever agreement emerged could not simply replace one form of quiet control with another dressed in gentler language. Slowly, painfully, a new framework began to take shape, one built around shared councils rather than a single ruling authority, around agreements that could be questioned and revisited rather than handed down and enforced without appeal. It satisfied no one completely, and Nathan often said afterward that this, more than anything else, was proof it was probably fair. In the days that followed, faced with a coalition too large and too determined to be ignored, Council leadership was forced into negotiations, unlike any in its long history. Negotiations built not around the terms of a single powerful government, dictating to smaller, weaker worlds, but around fair representation for every species involved. It was not a perfect resolution, nor an easy one, but it marked the beginning of something entirely new, a shift away from an empire built on control, toward something closer to genuine partnership between the many different peoples who called that region of space home. Back on Earth, life slowly began to return to a new kind of normal, one shaped permanently by everything that had happened since the morning Ivy Bellamy disappeared from a quiet field outside her family's home. She grew up surrounded by a world that remembered her name, not because of the fear of that single terrifying morning, but because of everything that had followed, the courage, the unity, and the refusal to accept that a single life mattered less, simply because of where she came from. Nathan Ashford remained at the heart of Earth's growing role among the stars, now working not just to defend his home, but to help build lasting relationships with the many allies who had stood beside Earth in its greatest hour of need. Kale, once a quiet, dutiful servant of an empire he had never truly believed in, became one of the most trusted voices in the new era of cooperation between species, who had once known only fear and control. And somewhere on a quiet colony world, Adam and Claire Bellamy watched their daughter grow older, safe and unafraid, carrying with her a story that would be remembered for generations, not as a tale of tragedy, but as the very beginning of a moment when an entire civilization chose to stand together, refusing to let fear decide what was possible. The empire that had once ruled through quiet, unquestioned control had not been destroyed, but it had been changed forever, humbled by a species it had once dismissed as too small, too young, and too insignificant to matter. Years later, a young woman stood at the edge of the same wheat field where it had all begun, watching a group of children chase a small drone across the open grass, their laughter carrying across the same gentle slope where a shadow had once fallen from the sky. Ivy Bellamy was no longer the frightened child who had been carried away that morning. She had grown into someone who spoke often at gatherings of the many species now bound together in careful, evolving partnership, sharing her own story not as a warning, but as proof of what could grow from even the most frightening beginning. She still carried the small carved stone the quiet outpost worker had once given her, kept now in a simple pouch she wore around her neck, a reminder that even within the coldest systems of control, small acts of kindness had never fully disappeared. Somewhere among the crowds who came to hear her speak, Nathan Ashford and Kale could often be found standing together near the back, two old friends who had once carried a frightened child home across the stars, now watching as she carried their story forward into a future none of them could have imagined on the morning it all began. And across every world that had once lived in silence, A new understanding had taken root, one that would shape the future of that region of space for generations to come. No one, no matter how powerful, was ever truly untouchable. And no child, no matter how small, was ever truly alone.